We have to look at it and say there were conflicts, that was a muddle, but not one that was intended.
But you do agree that it is a conflict of interest?
It's hard to say that we agree it's a conflict. We agree that looking back in hindsight, you can see how it's confusing.
In April 2020, 99-year-old war veteran Captain Tom Moore became an unexpected national hero. His family set him the challenge of walking 100 laps of their garden with the modest aim of raising £1,000 for NHS charities.
I'm not proud for me, but I'm proud for the fact that we're working and doing such a good job for the National Health Service, for all those nurses and doctors. It's unbelievable the service that they're giving. We never for a minute thought that we'd make 2 million. But so where will it stop? I just don't know. I don't care, as long as it keeps going.
His efforts captivated the nation at a time of global crisis and thrust him into the limelight. And in less than 4 weeks, Captain Tom had raised an astonishing £38.9 million. But his legacy quickly turned sour. His astronomical rise led to a catastrophic and very public fall for his family and the charity created in his name. From Third Sector, this is When Charity Goes Wrong, with me, Lucinda Rouse. In this episode, the Captain Tom Foundation. Why was regulatory action taken against the charity and Captain Tom's family? How clear-cut were the complaints against them? And what constitutes a personal benefit in charity law?
We were engaged with the world. People from 162 countries donated to that 38.9 million, an extraordinary amount when you think that there are only about 193 countries.
Hannah Ingram-Moore is the daughter of Captain Sir Tom Moore, as he later became.
It was frantic. It was crazy. There were highs and there were lows. There were tears, there was laughter. But most importantly, we felt this burden of responsibility to support people who were looking to my father to give them hope. This was something new. This was supporting hope for the world. And we as a family were trying to see what could we do to ensure that that legacy lived on for generations to come. And it was with that in mind that we were talking to a friend of ours who suggested, well, why don't you set up a charity?
And within 2 months of her father's record-breaking fundraising feat, the Captain Tom Foundation was born. Its aim, to support charitable causes close to Captain Tom's heart, including loneliness and mental health. But things quickly started to go wrong. Just a few months after the foundation's launch, the regulator started looking into concerns about its setup and governance arrangements. This was followed by a full-blown statutory inquiry the following year.
Part of the difficulty with all of this is that the Captain Tom brand wasn't owned by the charity, so there was limited control from the charity side over things that the family did.
This is Liz Brownsell. She's a partner at the law firm Birketts. And although she has no direct connection to the whole Captain Tom saga, she's taken a keen interest in it.
It was a whole series of things, and it sort of, every layer that was peeled revealed another layer, and it provided so much material for press coverage that it became a very long-running story. They should not have tried to make money from the Captain Tom brand at the same time as launching the foundation. The right thing to do was to choose one or the other.
The lines quickly became blurred between the Captain Tom Foundation and the family's for-profit work. The foundation's official launch was in September 2020. It was planned to coincide with the publication of Captain Tom's autobiography, the first of several books for which he received an advance of almost £1.5 million. In the prologue, he expresses his pleasure that this autobiography was giving him the chance to raise money for the foundation. But, in reality, the publishing advance was not for the charity. It was to go to Club Nook, a private company set up by Hannah Ingram-Moore and her husband Colin. And so the amount of money the charity received from the book would be entirely at the discretion of Club Nook and the family. Liz Brownsell.
Fundamentally, the difficulty with the books, it all comes down to public perception. When you put it all together, the launch at the same time, the prologue in the autobiography, the fact that the foundation itself advertised and promoted the book on its own website and through the online shop, it's very hard to see how anybody wouldn't think that buying the book was supporting the charity. And that's the problem. The public felt misled because there was a public perception that this book was being published to support the foundation. The big issue was the way and the timing around how the charity was launched, and just too much overlap between what they were doing personally and what they were doing for the foundation.
Now, Hannah and Colin Ingram-Moore didn't have any official role at the foundation at this point. It wasn't until the day before Captain Tom died in February 2021 that they both became trustees. And Hannah only held her trustee role for a matter of weeks before she was appointed chief executive of the Captain Tom Foundation on an interim basis. This was agreed with the Charity Commission, which placed a cap on how much she could earn in the role with a limited tenure of 9 months. Her stated charitable focus was addressing ageism and empowering the older generation. By May 2022, it was time for a new person to take the helm, and that responsibility fell to Jack Gilbert.
I took a career break whilst I cared for my late father. And then, of course, he passed, and immediately we went into lockdown.
Jack had been working in the charity sector since the 90s, and after his father's death and the lifting of lockdown restrictions, he started looking for his next role.
This was an organisation which was all about working to empower older people and integrate older people intergenerationally and cross-communally in wider community contexts. I obviously identified with this, and so that's why I put in an application. For me, it was an enormous opportunity. This was a high-profile role. It was high stakes.
Jack got the job and began commuting from his home in East London to the old rectory in Bedfordshire, the site of Captain Tom's famous laps, and now the foundation's headquarters.
I couldn't quite pin down what the purpose of the charity had been. You know, what was the theory of change for the first year of its life? So I was brought in to take the charity to really align it with best practice. They were buying into a change program, basically.
But on his first day in the office, as he was going through his induction, there was a meeting between the trustees and the Charity Commission. The regulator was about to launch its inquiry into the foundation.
I understood there was a meeting with the Charity Commission. What I didn't know at the time was they were starting to raise questions about intellectual property, how much control the charity had about its own intellectual property. There was a question around whether they could produce a mug or whether they would need to ask the consent of Club Nook. And it was clear that the Charity Commission were unhappy with the response of what came out of the conversation. I wasn't aware of any of that, but I'd begun to notice things like who owned our domain, who owned various bits of intellectual property, and I was getting already that these were things that would need to be clarified.
So it was Club Nook, the company named in Captain Tom's book deal, that all his intellectual property rights were licensed to. Or in other words, control for the Captain Tom brand sat firmly with his family and not the charity. Their consent for the foundation to use the name Captain Tom could be withdrawn at any point, meaning the charity couldn't act independently. And as the issue with the books showed, this overlap of personal and charitable interests created the potential for confusion.
And it's not as if, people confuse the Elton John Foundation with Elton John, because both are very clear when something's being done for commercial purposes and when something is being done for the benefit of the charity. So there's no reason why you can't have a commercial and a charitable activity that are completely separately understood and there is no confusion. The problem is when people are using almost identical branding for a commercial activity compared to the one for the charity. And it could have been set up in a much more explicitly separate way. And I thought initially that this was just unclear thinking, naivety. But it became clear that they weren't going to reach a resolution to normalising the intellectual property situation. And that was deeply disturbing. And I stopped going into the office because it became clear that there were difficult negotiations going on.
Negotiations between who?
Between the independent trustees and the family.
Charity intrinsically is about others. It's not about self. It's how you can serve and help others.
David Holdsworth, Chief Executive of the Charity Commission. David's keen to stress that the use and whereabouts of the millions raised by Captain Tom before the foundation was formed was never called into question. It has nothing to do with the inquiry.
It was the setup of the subsequent charity where we found issues and where the inquiry found in particular a pattern of the blurring of the lines between the charity's interests and the private and commercial interests of individuals involved in the charity. So we found that conflicts of interest were not managed appropriately. We found that these weren't just a one-off and that they were occurring repeatedly. And so we concluded that the failings amounted to misconduct and or mismanagement.
First, intellectual property concerns, now conflicts of interest. I asked our legal expert, Liz Brownsell, to explain a conflict of interest in the charity context.
Okay, so a conflict of interest is any situation where a trustee of a charity has an interest or a loyalty somewhere else that may or might be perceived to conflict with the interests of the charity. Principally, the conflicts of interests arose for Colin and Hannah Ingram-Moore. Primarily Colin, because he was a trustee. There were situations where Hannah, during her tenure as interim CEO, received benefits. So the big example there is the £18,000 that she was paid for her appearance at the awards, the Virgin Media Awards. And because Colin was a trustee at the time, and that hadn't been approved by the Charity Commission, it constituted an unauthorised personal benefit to Colin indirectly, because he was married to Hannah and she was the CEO. And whilst she has said publicly that her appearance was separate and it was a sort of historic arrangement, unfortunately, whether this was well intended, she went and asked them to involve the foundation in that arrangement. So the foundation's name and logo was all over the awards, and the charity was also asked to do promotion of the awards. So everything got very blurred, and it's very difficult to see how you could justify being paid personally when you are there as a representative of the charity in your capacity as a CEO. And in any event, it wasn't authorised, so it was an unauthorised personal benefit.
We accept that there were things that should have been done differently if we were to look back in time, knowing what we now know.
Hannah Ingram-Moore.
The Virgin Media contract was a contract that I'd brought on from the relationship my father and I had with Virgin. As Virgin have also said, and I feel very sorry for them because they've been pulled into this, their relationship was with me. And I needn't have in any way included the charity, but I did. I involved the charity to benefit the charity. We'll give the charity some space and time and include it to give it more something. And I can see now that that looks, in charity law, conflicting.
During my interview with Hannah, she said she accepted that her family's involvement with the foundation had created conflicts of interest according to charity law. I asked her to tell me what they were.
My father wrote a book. He wrote books. Those books, that agreement was established with him and Penguin Random House before the charity was formed. It was not a charity book. We said, because, wow, this is an amazing moment, we'll support the launch of the charity. And that's what the first book was going to do. And it did. It did, with tens of thousands of pounds used from the advance that my father was given for writing the books, supported the launch of the charity. That is now considered a conflict.
Do you view that as a conflict of interest?
I think, looking back, we didn't need to support the launch with the book. We could have been doing that in lots of other ways. It was my father's money. He chose what to do with it. And we willingly said, well, let's spend some of it in supporting the launch. In hindsight, all that did was confuse things. And so whilst it came from a very good place, and we did what we said we were going to do by using money from the advance he got in supporting the launch of the charity, looking back, you can see that was a muddle, but not one that was intended, because we did everything we believed we'd signed up to do.
But you do agree that it is a conflict of interest?
Do I agree it's a conflict? It's hard to say that we agree it's a conflict. We agree that looking back in hindsight, you can see how it's confusing.
And indeed, even the inquiry report says it's difficult to tell whether the issues surrounding the book deal constituted a conflict of interest or not. This is because Hannah and Colin were not trustees of the foundation at that point and had no officially defined role. The report lists inconsistencies in how Hannah has previously described her involvement with the foundation in its early days. One thing is clear. She and Colin weren't listed in any official capacity with the Charity Commission.
We knew nothing about charity and so therefore didn't get involved in its formation. We weren't involved in the onboarding of trustees. In fact, there was total separation because we were busy over here supporting my father as he was continuing to talk to the world. And the charity, they were very clear, the trustees didn't want the family to be engaged, didn't want it to be part of that setup process. Willingly, we said, yes, you can use the name Captain Tom next to the words foundation and set up something that will ensure that legacy lives for as long as it can. That was the emotion, that was the intent, but not with us involved in any way in the setup. If you look at why the inquiry was established, it was about intellectual property and trademarks at the formation of the charity. None of us in my family were trustees at that time. And the Charity Commission had asked those founding trustees to establish an agreement with us, but we didn't know they'd been asked to do that because they never asked us to do that. And yet, there we were, front and centre, on the front page of the inquiry.
The Commission's inquiry found that the founding trustees had failed to respond to advice to secure written agreements with the family over the intellectual property rights. The inquiry also looked into the planning application made by the Ingram-Moores for what has now become their infamous spa building. The application was lodged while Colin was a trustee and Hannah the chief executive. It was originally made for a single-storey building in their garden for use by the family and the Captain Tom Foundation. It ended up being demolished. The addition of a swimming pool and a spa was not part of those plans and failed to get retrospective permission. The regulator brought a verdict of misconduct and/or mismanagement in the administration of the charity by Hannah and Colin. This is because they had listed the Captain Tom Foundation in the planning application without the knowledge or consent of the other trustees. I asked Hannah about this.
It was going to be a magical space for people to come. In fact, if it had been there, I would have suggested we would have done this podcast there. That building was built with our own money, on our own land, on our own time. It wasn't a charity building. What we said is the charity could use it. Many of my father's things were going to be in it. In its initial documents, the Captain Tom and the word foundation was on it. There was no intent for it to be there, and we removed it. So, yes, it shouldn't have been there. But as soon as we realised that it was there, we changed it.
How did it get in there in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. And there is no doubt that my husband and I, we're responsible. We should have seen it on the application. But I suppose it's a bit like being noseblind. When you're used to seeing things so much, we should have picked it up and we didn't. But we corrected it. And the charity was only going to gain by being able to use the space. There was nothing to damage the charity in that application.
One could argue, though, and I'm thinking about public trust in this instance, that having this blow up and you ended up having to demolish that building because of the changes that were made that hadn't been authorised, you could say that that's incredibly damaging to trust for the work of the foundation. Would you not agree with that?
Well, if you look at that building was our building. It was on our land with our money. So the reason it blew up is because there was a whirling suggestion that we'd use charity money. That's why it went crazy. And we didn't. And we accept the name was an issue, but got corrected. So yeah, of course we're prepared to take a rap over the hands for things that weren't perfect. But who's perfect?
Here's Liz Brownsell.
The spa building was probably the biggest story in the press because it was a very visual story, something that people could really talk about. And it looked very much like the family were just trying to benefit, because why would you need a spa building for a charity in your back garden? Hannah and Colin have said many times that it was an error that the foundation's name was on that original planning application. But I think it's very unlikely that they would have got the consent if it wasn't. If you accept Hannah and Colin's story that it was an error, then that explains why Colin didn't speak to the other trustees about it. But the difficulty with the whole situation is it is a very clear benefit from association with a charity, which was not authorised and should never have been applied for without the full consent of the other trustees and a consideration of whether the private benefit to the family was more than merely incidental, and if it was, getting appropriate authority for that benefit.
I kind of knew I was going to find a mess. I didn't think I'd find anything that would be permanently, terminally damaging.
Jack Gilbert. To support the change programme he was brought in to deliver, the board had begun the recruitment process for some new trustees. But when the Charity Commission inquiry launched, that proved difficult.
People who had been lined up to join the board understandably decided that this wasn't something for them. And of course, no one wants to join a board where there's a formal charity inquiry going on. Who would?
This made governing the charity very difficult, particularly when there were sticky negotiations happening between the independent trustees and the family, one of whom was also on the board, over the intellectual property rights to the Captain Tom brand.
It was becoming clear that the family were not going to provide a straightforward pathway out. They weren't going to agree to a written license. So ultimately, the only choice we had after several months of working on this was to close everything up and basically mothball the charity, whilst the Charity Commission was seeking to address what had been going on. That's what we did. We mothballed the charity, and that's when I left.
How did you feel?
It was really upsetting. It, for me, was just such a missed opportunity. There's no way about it.
Less than 5 months after joining, Jack's time at the Captain Tom Foundation was over, and the charity's activities had ground to a halt. I put Jack's comments about intellectual property rights to Hannah. She sent back a statement reiterating that the family had confirmed the intellectual property position of the Captain Tom name to the charity back in May 2020. She added, "Jack Gilbert's recent comments are speculative at best and not grounded in fact. He was not a trustee and held no formal authority in matters concerning intellectual property, nor did he have any authority in any related decision-making processes." Today, the organisation is dormant. The Captain Tom Foundation is no more. While it hasn't actually been wound up, its charity number has replaced the foundation's name on the Charity Commission registry. So how can other charities ensure they avoid this sorry situation? David Holdsworth.
The first thing is ensure you know about and are managing any conflicts of interest or loyalty. You can have a conflict. The important thing is it's known about, it's documented, and there's been a discussion about how to manage and mitigate that conflict. Know and follow the law on trustee payments. Trustee payments are allowed, but the law is very clear on the circumstances they are allowed in. And it also has to be in the best interest of the charity, not the individual and not the particular circumstance. It is the best interest of the charity that must drive the decision. And then finally, I would say, be really clear about fundraising arrangements, especially when working with commercial partners, how you enter them, the contractual arrangements you have around them, and how the funding is derived and where that funding flows to.
While Hannah accepts that mistakes were made, she feels very wronged by the regulator.
There's no question that if we look back through the lens of the last years, we would say, yeah, the lines were blurred between Captain Tom family and the Captain Tom Foundation, but never, ever, ever, from our point of view, with any intent to cause harm. By moving closer and trying to support the charity through everything we did, it now has been portrayed as that we've repeatedly benefited, when from our outset, what we wanted to happen was for the charity to benefit from things we were doing. Our lawyers at some point in all of this, because we have spent a huge amount of money trying to defend our position, said that the way that the Commission were chasing us was likened to the Spanish Inquisition, that they had set out to ensure we were guilty of something. And come what may, they would find something.
It sounds as though you feel like the Charity Commission was attacking you personally more than they were being unjust towards the foundation. Is that correct?
I think that they were unjust towards the charity because it didn't need to go straight to that draconian inquiry. It was being handed over to a new CEO. There was a great time and opportunity to say, right, what do we stand for? What does that charity stand for? What's it going to do within the charity sector? So I think it absolutely behaved unfairly towards the charity, but I think it's behaved grossly unfairly towards me personally.
So what would you have liked them to have done differently apart from not launched into a statutory inquiry?
Be supportive. There was no arms around. And maybe I have come to think that that isn't the role of a regulator. But then who does that? Who puts the arms around? As a regulator, why go for the stick? Is that really what we need our regulators to do? Instead, sit down, talk. It could have all been resolved. So I think that they went for overkill. I think it was unnecessary. And the consequence of that is that as I was handing over the charity to the next CEO, we were looking to push that charity into a global fundraising space. It could have had long-term global positive societal impact, and the Charity Commission's actions killed it. It's a loss that I still feel.
We put Hannah's comments to the Charity Commission. We received a statement back saying the regulator stood by the findings of its inquiry of repeated instances where Hannah and Colin Ingram-Moore's actions blurred the boundaries between their private interests and those of the charity. The statement also said the Commission had provided advice to the charity long before the inquiry was opened. Had our advice been followed, it said, the serious, high-profile public concerns about unmanaged conflicts of interest and personal benefit might have been avoided, and the charity might not have suffered the serious reputational damage and regulatory consequences that followed. Liz Brownsell.
The Commission doesn't launch statutory inquiries lightly. They will usually start with an informal investigation, and it will only be escalated to a statutory inquiry if the criteria are met. The issues in this case were significant, and as I said, it was cumulative. It built and built and built. And the Commission had already addressed some of the issues informally. So there was involvement, given the high-profile nature of the charity and what they were trying to achieve. They would have been well advised to get some training if they weren't clear on their role and their responsibilities. But there isn't somebody out there that is going to step in and help people. You have to seek it for yourself. So you either need to go and read the guidance, there's lots of it on the Charity Commission website, or seek professional advice, whether that's from a consultant. There are many excellent charity consultants. You don't have to go to a lawyer.
Hannah's employment within the voluntary sector has been high profile but short-lived. In June last year, she and Colin were banned by the Charity Commission from holding senior charity leadership or trustee roles for 10 and 8 years respectively. The regulator said their disqualification on the grounds of misconduct and or mismanagement was in the public interest. The Ingram-Moores disagreed with the decision, but decided not to appeal. Hannah said they didn't have the money to fight.
We try to do everything to support the charity. And that's what leaves us so sad now. What we tried to do was always try and bring the charity in. And that's probably the biggest misstep. We should have stayed removed. I don't think anybody can expect that everything we ever did forever would all go to charity. But what we were saying is we could do great things and provide an income stream to the charity. If I could undo anything, I would undo ever having that conversation where our contact said, "Oh, why don't you set up a charity?" The next question we should have said was, "Well, what other options do we have?" And I wished we'd had more knowledge. I wish we'd counselled more people. I wish that we hadn't rushed.
What do you think might have been a viable and worthwhile alternative to a charity?
Yeah, I think a social impact organisation, something where we still could have great social impact, but not caught up in the charity world.
Coming up in the next episode of When Charity Goes Wrong.
The majority of charities, honestly, probably wouldn't have survived an inquiry like ours in the circumstances we had. A regulator should support, should challenge, should take action when they need to, but that doesn't demonstrate a regulator who's in touch with the sector that they're regulating.
We'll be finding out about the regulatory challenges encountered by the charity Mermaids. When Charity Goes Wrong is brought to you by Third Sector, the UK's leading title for the voluntary and not-for-profit sector. It was written and presented by me, Lucinda Rouse, and produced by Nav Pal. The executive producer is Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. We hope you're enjoying the series so far, and if you are, please spread the word and share with others who might be interested in listening. To make sure you don't miss the third and final episode, follow us on either the End of Charity or the Third Sector podcast feeds. And if you'd like to go the extra mile, leaving a positive rating or review on your preferred podcast platform would really help us. We'd love to hear your feedback on the series. Thank you for listening.